There are moments in life when power meets humility, and the collision changes everything. He was a millionaire, polished and certain of his own importance. She was an ordinary woman, calm but unshakable, the kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. And in one unforgettable moment, when he challenged her in front of everyone, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "If you want respect, start by giving it." That single sentence shattered his world and rebuilt it. This is not just a story about wealth, or pride, or success. It's a story about what truly defines worth, about the quiet power of integrity, and how one act of courage can awaken something greater than ambition, humanity itself. Stay with this story, and you'll see how a man who had everything learned what it means to deserve something. Because sometimes it takes being humbled by truth to finally understand what respect really is. That Beau Charleston's Grand Hall shimmered that evening, like a memory from another time. Chandeliers glowed above marble floors, polished to a mirror's shine, reflecting gowns, tuxedos, and the glint of champagne glasses raised to a man who seemed to own the very air Elliot Caldwell. To his guests, he was the embodiment of success, a self-made millionaire, a visionary whose name carried weight in every corner of the city. Yet, beneath the music and the murmur of flattery, there was something colder, a rhythm of pride pulsing through the night. Clara Bennett noticed it all from the edge of the ballroom. She wasn't there to mingle or to be admired. As part of the event's logistics team, she was the quiet kind of presence, steady, attentive, the one people forgot to thank but relied on when things went wrong. Her dress was simple black, professional, unremarkable, except for the way her eyes missed nothing. While servers swept past with trays of hors d'oeuvres, Clara's gaze drifted upward. Near the west arch, the lighting rig, a gleaming structure hung high above the dance floor, shuddered slightly with each pulse of the bass from the live band. It was subtle, but to someone who had spent years managing venues and events, it was a warning. One loosened bolt, one inattentive moment, and what was meant to illuminate could fall and destroy. She walked toward it, weaving between guests lost in laughter and expensive perfume. "Excuse me," she said softly to a technician standing idle by the rig controls. "That beam is shifting. You need to secure it." Before he cut her off with a shrug. "It's fine, ma'am. We checked everything an hour ago." "It's not fine," Clara insisted, her tone still calm but firm. "Look at the sway. Someone could get hurt." The man hesitated, uneasy under her gaze. Before he could answer, another voice broke through the hum of the crowd, smooth, commanding, unmistakable. "Is there a problem here?" Elliot Caldwell stood a few feet away, a glass of scotch in one hand, his tuxedo impeccable, his confidence absolute. The music seemed to quiet around him. Clara straightened. "There's a potential safety issue with the lighting rig," she said. "I'm recommending a temporary stop until it's secured." The crowd nearby turned curious. Elliot's brow lifted slightly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A temporary stop. During my gala," he chuckled softly, as though humoring a child. "I assure you, Ms. Bennett," she replied. "Ms. Bennett, my team is quite competent. I don't think we need to alarm the guests over a loose screw." She felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from quiet disbelief. "Respectfully, Mr. Caldwell, this isn't about appearances. It's about safety." That word respectfully hung in the air like a challenge. Guests pretended not to listen, but their glances lingered. Elliot's voice dropped a note lower. "I built this company by trusting my people. Ms. Bennett, I suggest you do the same." Her instinct told her to retreat, to nod and step aside. That would have been easier, but easier rarely meant right. She took a breath, walked to the control panel, and with steady hands turned down the light intensity. The beam trembled again, proving her point. The technician blanched. Silence spread through the room. Elliot's expression shifted, pride giving way to realization, but only for a moment. He covered it with irritation. "You've made your point," he said tightly. "Get it fixed, then." Clara nodded and directed the staff to secure the rig. Within minutes, the wobble was gone. replaced by a clean, steady glow across the ballroom. The band resumed playing, but the atmosphere had changed. A ripple of whispers followed her as she crossed the floor, her dignity intact, her heartbeat steady despite the eyes that judged her. Later that night, when most guests had returned to their laughter and wine, Elliot found her near the back hallway, checking equipment one last time. He studied her with curiosity edged by annoyance. "You handled that rather dramatically," he said. She met his gaze without flinching. "I handled it responsibly." He gave a low, disbelieving laugh. "You realize you embarrassed my staff and me in front of half the city. If preventing an accident is embarrassing," she said gently, "then perhaps we've been valuing the wrong things." He tilted his head, not used to defiance delivered in such calm tones. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "Yes," she replied. "A man who built an empire and forgot that respect isn't measured by how high people look up to you, but by how you look back at them." Her words struck like quiet thunder. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, just steady truth. Elliot blinked, taken aback, as though someone had opened a window in a room he'd sealed long ago. For a moment, there was no sound except the soft hum of distant conversation. Then Clara stepped past him, her steps unhurried, her poise unshaken. As she reached the door, she turned once more, her voice low but clear. "If you want respect," she said, "start by giving it." And then she was gone, leaving him standing alone amid the fading music. A man who had everything money could buy, and yet, suddenly, inexplicably, felt the weight of something he'd lost along the way. Outside, the night air was cool and gentle. Clara paused beneath the magnolia trees, breathing deeply. The stars above Charleston shimmered like tiny lanterns, patient and knowing. She thought of her late husband's words about integrity, about how it costs nothing to do what's right. Yet, somehow, it's always the hardest thing to give. Behind her, the grand hall glowed with light, steady and secure now, as if silently vindicating her. Somewhere inside, a man's pride had cracked just a little, but enough for a new truth to slip through. And though she didn't see it, Elliot watched her from the balcony, the echo of her words settling in his mind like a seed that might one day grow. That night, both of them carried something away from the ballroom. She, a quiet peace that comes from standing firm. He, a question that would not leave him alone. Sometimes, the first storm isn't thunder or rain. It's the sound of two souls colliding, one built on power, the other on principle and finding, in the clash, the faint beginning of change. The morning after the gala broke quietly over Charleston, soft light spilling across the harbor like forgiveness no one had yet earned. But inside Caldwell Enterprises, forgiveness was not part of the day's agenda. The air buzzed with whispers sharp, clipped, and full of judgment. Clara Bennett arrived early, as she always did. Her footsteps echoed through the marble lobby, steady despite the glances that followed her. She could feel it in the way conversations paused when she passed, in the brittle smiles that greeted her, too polite to be kind, too rehearsed to be real. The night before, she had done what she believed was right. This morning, it was being rewritten as a scandal. By mid-morning, the rumors had matured into accusation. Some said she had disrespected the boss, others claimed she'd tried to draw attention to herself. A few, more quietly, admired her courage but didn't dare say so aloud. In the break room, Marjorie, an older colleague with kind eyes and decades of survival under corporate ceilings, approached her. "Honey," she whispered, lowering her voice, "you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Elliot's people don't take well to being corrected, especially not in public." Clara offered a tired smile. "I didn't correct them. I prevented an accident." "I know that," Marjorie said gently. "But around here, perception matters more than truth." The words stung because they were true. Clara sipped her coffee, though it had gone cold. For a brief moment, she wondered if she should have stayed silent. Maybe she could have spoken to someone quietly, privately. Maybe she could have avoided all this. But then she remembered the tremor of that unsteady light, the sound it had made metal shifting, warning her. And she remembered her late husband, James, standing in their old kitchen years ago, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright with conviction. Integrity, he'd once told her, is what you keep when the world gives you every reason to let it go. So, she stayed at her desk. She did her work. And when the message arrived at noon, Mr. Caldwell would like to see you in his office. She simply nodded and stood. Elliot Caldwell's office occupied the top floor, a place of glass and skyline and quiet authority. When Clara entered, the air was cool and still. He didn't offer her a seat at first. He simply stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. The city sprawled beneath him like something he owned. "I assume you know why you're here," he said finally. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay something hard and deliberate. "I do," Clara replied. He turned to face her. The light from the window cut sharp lines across his face, emphasizing the control he wore like armor. "You embarrassed me last night," he said, "and my team. That isn't something easily overlooked." Clara's pulse quickened, but her voice stayed even. "I did what I had to do to keep people safe." The lighting rig was unstable. His jaw tightened. "My engineers checked everything. You undermined their authority in front of our investors. Do you understand what that looks like?" "It looks," she said softly, "like someone cared enough to act before something went wrong." The room went still. Elliot studied her, searching for fear, for apology, something he could categorize. But there was none, just calm and conviction, and a quiet strength that unsettled him more than anger would have. He moved behind his desk, leaning slightly forward. "You're confident," he said. "Perhaps too confident." "Confidence isn't the same as arrogance," she replied. "I don't think either of us needs a lesson on which one does more damage." For a heartbeat, the air between them trembled sharp, electric. Elliot drew in a slow breath, surprised not only by her words but by his own reaction to them. No one spoke to him like that. Not his executives, not his partners, not even the board. But this woman, standing in a simple navy blouse with her hands clasped calmly before her, did. He sat down, as if needing the chair to anchor him. "Do you know how rare it is," he said quietly, "for someone in your position to refuse an apology when one might save their career?" Clara met his gaze, her voice steady, respectfully. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't see why I should apologize for doing what was right. If integrity cost me this job, then that's a price I can live with." For the first time, he didn't have a ready response. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was reflective, almost human. Elliot's fingers traced the edge of his desk, a small, absent gesture. Something in her words had struck deeper than he wanted to admit. Finally, he leaned back, eyes unreadable. "You can go," he said. "That'll be all." Clara nodded, turning to leave. But as she reached the door, he spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. "No one's ever talked to me that way before." She paused, glancing back. "Maybe that's the problem," she said gently. When the door closed behind her, Elliot sat alone in his immaculate office, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. For years, he had built walls of control and certainty around himself. Yet somehow, in less than 10 minutes, a woman he barely knew had found a way through. Downstairs. Clara returned to her desk. She felt drained but strangely lighter. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, whether she'd still have her job, or whether Elliot Caldwell would retaliate. But deep inside, she felt a quiet steadiness. Because sometimes, dignity doesn't roar at whispers. It shows up in small acts of courage, in choosing truth over convenience, even when no one applauds. Outside, the afternoon sun poured through the glass like gold, catching the faint reflection of her face, tired. Yes, but unwavering. In that moment, she thought of James again, and the promise she'd made to herself after he was gone to never let fear decide the kind of woman she would be. And as the city moved on around her, busy and unknowing, Clara sat in the calm after her own storm, unshaken, unbowed, and more alive than ever. Days turned into weeks, yet the echo of that conversation in Elliot Caldwell's office lingered in the corners of Clara's mind, quiet, persistent, like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Life at Caldwell Enterprises had returned to its routine rhythm on the surface, but beneath it, subtle ripples remained. Some colleagues spoke to her in cautious tones now, measuring their words. Others avoided her altogether, unsure if her calm defiance was bravery or recklessness. Elliot, for his part, became more distant, or perhaps just more deliberate. He passed her in hallways without expression, his sharp eyes revealing nothing. Yet, every so often, she caught a fleeting look, a trace of something like curiosity, or maybe respect, though neither of them would have dared to name it. Then one Monday morning, when spring light was spilling gently through the glass facade of the building, Clara received an unexpected summons. Meeting with Mr. Caldwell. 9:00 a.m. She walked into his office once again, unsure what awaited her. Elliot stood by the window, as always, the skyline of Charleston reflected in the glass. He didn't greet her right away. Instead, he spoke as if continuing a conversation he'd been having in his own head. "I'm launching a new project," he said finally. "A redevelopment along the coast, luxury resorts, shopping, private marinas. It's meant to bring progress to an area that's been neglected for decades." Clara listened carefully, hearing both the ambition and the blindness in his tone. "And the locals?" she asked. He turned to face her, almost smirking. "They'll benefit, eventually, jobs, infrastructure." She raised an eyebrow. "Or displacement." His jaw tightened. "You sound like one of the activists already." "I sound like someone who listens," she replied quietly. Elliot's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, assessing. Then he moved behind his desk and slid a folder across the surface. "Since you're so good at listening, Ms. Bennett, I'm putting you in charge of community relations. You'll attend the town meetings, handle the concerns, smooth things over, make them understand this project is good for them." It was said casually, but she heard the edge beneath it. To him. It was a demotion masked as diplomacy, a way to move her out of his immediate circle without openly punishing her. Clara glanced at the folder, then back at him. "So, this is a punishment." Elliot gave a half smile. "Let's call it an opportunity to prove that your version of integrity can be productive." For a long moment, neither spoke. She could have refused. She could have told him she knew what he was doing, that this assignment was meant to test her, to humble her. But she also saw something else in his eyes, hidden beneath the arrogance, a challenge. "I'll take it," she said simply. He looked surprised, though he covered it quickly. "Very well. The first town meeting is Thursday. I expect results." As she left his office, Clara's heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the quiet spark of purpose she hadn't felt in a while. That afternoon, Marjorie found her packing files and maps into a worn leather tote. "I heard about your new assignment," she said softly. "Clara, be careful. Those coastal folks don't trust big money, and they'll see you as its voice." "I know," Clara said, "but maybe they just need someone who speaks differently." Marjorie frowned, worry creasing her brow. "Elliot's not sending you there to help them. He's sending you to silence them. That man doesn't like being told no." Clara smiled faintly. "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of no." That evening, she sat by her small kitchen window, watching the light fade over the marshes. Her son, Owen, was away at college now, and the house felt emptier without his laughter echoing through the rooms. The quiet had grown familiar, but not always comfortable. She reached for the folder on the table, flipping through the glossy pages of blueprints and marketing plans. To most, the renderings were beautiful, sleek buildings rising along the shore, glass and steel catching the sun. But to Clara, each line on the page felt like an erasure of something older, softer, more human. She thought of the families who had lived by that coast for generations, the fishermen, the artisans, the small business owners who carried stories older than the city itself. She thought of their porches, weathered by salt and time, their children playing barefoot in the sand. Progress was a fine word, she mused, but it had a cost, and too often, those who paid it never got to speak. On Thursday, she drove 50 miles south to the town of Seabrook Landing, where the first meeting would take place. The road wound past oak trees draped in Spanish moss, past old farmhouses and shrimp boats moored along narrow creeks. By the time she arrived at the small community hall, the sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in shades of gold and rust. Inside, the mood was wary. Dozens of locals filled the folding chairs, their faces lined with a mixture of fatigue and defiance. When she introduced herself, there were murmurs, some skeptical, some openly hostile. Another one from the city. Someone whispered. Clara didn't defend herself. She listened. For nearly 2 hours, she let them speak their fears about losing their land, their anger at promises made and broken before, their heartbreak at seeing their heritage turned into profit. She didn't interrupt. She took notes, asked gentle questions, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried warmth, not authority. I can't promise I'll fix everything, she said, but I can promise I'll listen, and I'll make sure your voices reach the people who need to hear them. It wasn't grand or polished, but it was real. And in that hall, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest crack in the wall between them. That night, as she drove back toward Charleston, the air smelled of salt and spring rain. She felt tired, but alive, her mind replaying the faces she'd seen, the doubt, the hope, the pride. Maybe Elliot had meant this as punishment. Maybe he wanted to prove she'd fail. But she knew better. Empathy, she thought, wasn't weakness. It was the quiet force that built bridges no blueprint ever could. And somewhere high above the city, Elliot Caldwell might still have believed he'd sent her away to contain a problem. He didn't yet realize he'd set something in motion, something that would change not only the project, but him. Because sometimes, the smallest assignment turns out to be the most extraordinary beginning. In the weeks that followed that first meeting at Seabrook Landing, something began to shift so quietly that no one could name it, yet everyone could feel it. The Coastal Project, once seen as just another line on a spreadsheet, had become something living in Clara's hands. She didn't manage it with authority or speeches. She managed it with patience, with listening, with an empathy that disarmed even those most determined to distrust her. Word of her progress drifted back to Charleston like an unexpected rumor. The locals who once refused to shake hands with company representatives were now inviting her to their porches, serving her sweet tea, telling her stories about the tides and the land. It wasn't approval, at least, not yet, but it was something rarer, willingness to be heard. Elliot Caldwell, reading the early reports, frowned. He didn't quite understand how she was doing it. Her methods didn't fit into any of his business models. Listening was not a strategy in his vocabulary. He was used to commanding, convincing, closing. But Clara's approach, quiet, patient, human, was working. Against his better judgment, he decided to see it for himself. The next Thursday, he arrived at the Seabrook Town Hall unannounced. The locals recognized him instantly. The polished car, the tailored suit. It all screamed of a world far removed from theirs. Conversations hushed. People folded their arms, wary. And when Clara looked up from the front of the room and saw him standing in the doorway, her surprise flickered only for a moment before settling into composure. "Mr. Caldwell," she greeted, her tone steady but measured. "I didn't expect you here. I thought I'd observe," he replied. "See how things are progressing." She nodded once. "Then you're welcome to listen." It was the kind of subtle reminder he wasn't used to hearing, a gentle nudge toward humility. He took a seat in the back row, his presence like a shadow stretching across the room. For the next hour, he watched as Clara guided the discussion. She didn't dominate it. She didn't defend the company or make grand promises. She simply asked questions. What matters most to you? What are you afraid of losing? What do you hope will remain? And the people answered, slowly at first, then with warmth. A fisherman spoke about the bay his father had taught him to sail on. A shop owner worried about tourists driving out the small town soul. A teacher asked if new money would mean old values forgotten. Clara listened, really listened, her pen moving lightly across her notebook. When she did speak, her words were thoughtful, never rushed. "I can't promise every outcome," she said, "but I promise your stories will shape what we build. Progress should never mean erasing people. It should mean including them." The crowd softened, the tension easing like the tide pulling gently back to sea. Elliot sat still, arms crossed, his mind strangely unsettled. He had built his career on numbers, projections, and control. Yet here was this woman, earning trust not with power, but with presence. He couldn't decide if he admired her or resented her for it. After the meeting, he lingered by the door as people filed out, nodding politely at him, but speaking only to Clara. She stayed behind, packing her notes. When she turned, she found him watching her. "You certainly have a way with them," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes curious. "It's not about having a way," she replied. "It's about giving them one." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," she said, "but it's worth trying." Outside, the late afternoon light fell across the marshes in long gold strokes. Clara walked beside him toward the parking lot, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel. "I didn't expect you to come," she said. "I wanted to see what all the noise was about," he admitted. "You seem to have a talent for turning skeptics into allies." "Not allies," she corrected gently. "Just people who feel seen." He glanced at her then, the edge of irritation flickering beneath something else he couldn't name. "You think that's enough, feelings." She stopped walking. Sometimes it's the only thing that ever changes anything. Elliot didn't reply. He looked out over the horizon, where the sun dipped low behind the water. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was contemplative, like two different truths learning to coexist. Back in Charleston, that evening lingered in his thoughts. He poured himself a drink, but it did little to settle him. Clara Bennett was beginning to unsettle the entire order of how he understood control. He'd thought compassion was a performance, something people used to manipulate or persuade. But with her, it wasn't strategy, it was conviction. He tried to dismiss it as idealism, the kind that burns bright and fades quickly. Yet the more he watched her, the more he saw a quiet power in the way she stood firm without aggression, how she turned resistance into dialogue, and how she never needed the spotlight to command the room. For a man like Elliot, whose life had been built on walls of self-reliance and armor of pride, it was both fascinating and threatening. Admiration slipped through his defenses, disguised as irritation. The next week, he attended again, this time not to monitor, but to understand. And as he sat among the townspeople, he caught himself listening too, not to their words, but to the way Clara responded, the patience in her voice, the respect she gave freely. Somewhere inside him, a question began to take root, a question he couldn't quite silence. What if she's right? What if strength isn't about control at all, but about compassion? That night, long after the meeting ended, he drove home alone under the Carolina stars. The road was quiet, the air thick with salt and memory. He rolled down the window, letting the wind sweep through, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel entirely certain of himself. Because sometimes the cracks in a man's armor don't come from defeat, they come from the first touch of light breaking through. In the days that followed, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift between Clara and Elliot. Their interactions, once edged with challenge and formality, softened into an unspoken understanding. He no longer looked at her merely as an employee, nor as an adversary. There was a quiet respect now, one that neither of them openly acknowledged. Yet both could feel. The Seabrook project was moving forward, though not without turbulence. A local paper had published an article accusing Caldwell Enterprises of exploiting coastal land under the guise of revitalization. Meetings grew tense again, investors grew restless, and through it all, Clara continued to bridge gaps, to steady the course, to hold space for both the business and the people it affected. One evening, long after the rest of the office had emptied, Clara found herself climbing the stairs to Elliot's floor. The night outside pressed gently against the tall glass windows, the city lights below flickering like stars caught in motion. She carried a folder of community reports, But it wasn't just work that led her there. It was something quieter concern, maybe even care. His office door was half open. She knocked softly. "Come in," came his voice, low and unguarded. Inside, the usual perfection of his workspace had given way to something more human. Papers scattered across the desk, a half-empty glass of bourbon beside an untouched dinner, and from a corner of the room, the faint, warm crackle of a record player. The melody that drifted through the air was slow, thoughtful old jazz, the kind that carries both sorrow and grace in every note. Clara hesitated at the doorway. "I didn't know you listened to music like this." Elliot glanced up from his chair, his expression tired but softer than she'd ever seen it. "Most people don't know much about me at all," he said quietly. She stepped inside, setting the folder down. "Long day." He gave a small laugh, one without humor. "Long life." For a moment, neither spoke. The music filled the space between them, an invisible bridge. Then, almost as if he couldn't stop himself, Elliot began to talk. "I grew up in the north end of Charleston," he said. "Not the part anyone puts on postcards. My father left when I was 9. My mother cleaned houses sometimes for the same people who sit across from me now in boardrooms." He paused, his gaze distant. "Back then, respect wasn't something given. You had to fight for it, and if you were poor, you had to fight twice as hard." Clara listened, her eyes steady on his. There was no pity in her expression, only quiet understanding. "I used to stand outside those grand houses," he continued, "watching men in suits come and go. I told myself I'd be one of them someday. I'd have power, money, influence enough that no one could ever look down on me again." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "And I did it. I built all of this. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what I was building it for." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Clara took a slow breath. "Maybe you didn't forget," she said softly. "Maybe you just stopped believing that respect could come from kindness, not fear." He looked up at her then, his defenses flickering. "You talk like it's easy." "It's not," she said, "but it's possible." Her voice carried something that steadied him, the same quiet conviction that had challenged him in that ballroom weeks ago. She wasn't preaching. She was simply speaking from a place of truth. He watched her in silence, the light from the desk lamp tracing the gentle lines of her face. "You make it sound like you've lived it," he said. Clara nodded. "I have." She told him then about her husband, James, about how cancer had taken him too soon, leaving her with a 10-year-old boy and a mortgage she didn't know how to pay. How she'd sat at the kitchen table night after night, trying to hold everything together while the world kept moving without her. "I learned something in those years," she said quietly. "You can lose almost everything and still keep your dignity if you hold on to compassion. For others, and for yourself." Elliot's eyes softened. "And your son Owen's in college now." She smiled faintly. "He's studying environmental science. He says he wants to build things that last, but not just buildings. He wants to build fairness." He let out a slow exhale, something like admiration threading through his tone. "Sounds like his mother." The record crackled gently as the final notes faded. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air felt different still, but alive, as if both were standing at the edge of something neither could yet name. "You know," Elliot said after a pause, "I've spent my whole life trying not to need anyone. It's efficient, but lately—" He trailed off, his gaze falling to the floor. "Lately, I've started wondering if maybe that's not strength, it's just fear dressed up as independence." Clara's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "There's a difference between standing alone and being alone." He looked up, meeting her eyes again. And for the first time, the man who built walls for a living seemed utterly without one. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. Outside, the rain had begun a light drizzle tapping against the glass, steady and calm. Clara rose to leave, gathering her folder, but he spoke before she reached the door. "Clara," he said, his voice low, uncertain. "Thank you." She turned, offering a gentle smile. For what? For reminding me that people still matter more than progress. She nodded, her expression warm. It's never too late to remember. When she left, the soft sound of the rain blended with the last echo of the jazz record still spinning in the corner. Elliot sat there long after she'd gone, the empty office no longer feeling like a fortress, but something closer to a confession. In the quiet that followed, he thought about the boy he'd been the one who stood outside those houses, watching and dreaming, and for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe success wasn't about how high he'd climbed, but about how deeply he could still feel. Sometimes, connection doesn't arrive with thunder or revelation. It comes gently, like an old song rediscovered on a quiet night, soft, unexpected, and exactly what the heart needed to remember, it was still alive. After that night in his office, the night of rain and jazz and quiet truths, something unspoken lingered between them. Neither Clara nor Elliot dared to name it, yet both could feel its steady presence, like the hum of a low chord that never faded completely. The air between them had changed. It wasn't romance, not exactly. It was something more fragile and more dangerous, a connection built not on words but on the slow, deliberate unraveling of walls. In the weeks that followed, their partnership deepened in ways neither had planned. Elliot began relying on Clara more openly, inviting her to high-level meetings, asking for her perspective before making decisions. She didn't flatter him, and he didn't expect her to. That honesty, sometimes uncomfortable, always steady, became the rhythm of their work together. The results spoke for themselves. Public perception of the Seabrook project began to shift. Articles that once accused the company of arrogance now mentioned words like community and collaboration. Even the skeptics admitted something was different about this effort. Elliot Caldwell, the man who had built an empire on steel and certainty, was starting to sound almost human. He owed much of that change to her, though he would never say it aloud, and she would never ask him to. On the surface, everything looked professional, but beneath it, something far more personal was growing. It showed in the way their conversations sometimes stretched past work hours, lingering long after the last employee had gone home. It showed in the easy silence they shared, when words weren't needed, when one would look up from a stack of papers and find the other already watching. It showed in the moments of laughter, rare, genuine, fleeting, that made the sterile office feel less like a battlefield and more like a refuge. But the world, of course, is never blind for long. Rumors began quietly, as they always do. A whisper in the hallway, a pause in conversation when one of them entered a room. Words like too close, inappropriate, unwise drifted through the air like smoke. Clara heard them first. She pretended she didn't, but she did. The knowing glances from colleagues, the too casual jokes about Mr. Caldwell's favorite, the sudden quiet when she walked into the break room. She told herself it didn't matter that her conscience was clear, that her work spoke for itself, but the unease crept in all the same. At night, she'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had crossed some invisible line. Was it wrong to feel drawn to someone who had once embodied everything she resisted? Was it foolish to believe that two people could change each other without losing themselves in the process? She tried to bury those questions in work, but feelings, like truth, have a way of surfacing. One evening, after a particularly long day, she stopped by Elliot's office to drop off a report. He was still there. Of course he was, his tie loosened, his desk scattered with papers. He looked up when she entered, a small smile touching his mouth. "Still here?" he asked. "So are you," she replied, setting the file down. "You should go home, Mr. Caldwell." He leaned back, studying her. "I could say the same to you, Ms. Bennett." There was a quiet warmth in his tone, the kind that felt like more than politeness. She hesitated, half turning toward the door, then paused. "Elliot," she said softly. "People are talking, I know," he said. Her eyes searched his. "And you're not concerned," he shrugged, though his jaw tightened. "People always talk. It doesn't matter. It might," she said. "To them, perception is reality." He looked at her for a long moment. And what's your perception? Clara. The sound of her name and his voice carried a weight that caught her off guard. She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. My perception, she said finally, is that we're walking a very thin line, and I'm not sure which side we're on anymore. He stood then, closing the space between them, but stopping just short of too close. His voice lowered. It's just professional chemistry, he said, as if repeating it might make it true. Clara's gaze didn't waver. You don't really believe that? For a heartbeat. The air between them stilled. Neither spoke, but everything in their silence did. Then she turned, quietly leaving the room, her footsteps fading down the hall like the echo of a truth neither could face. That night, Elliot sat in his office long after she'd gone, the words replayed in his mind, not hers, but his own. It's just professional chemistry. He'd meant to convince her. Instead, he found himself trying to convince himself. He poured a glass of bourbon and stared at the city lights beyond the window. Success had always been his compass. Logic had always been his armor. Yet now, both felt suddenly uncertain, blurred by the image of a woman whose calm strength had somehow reached the places in him he'd long declared off limits. Meanwhile, across town, Clara walked along the quiet waterfront, the night breeze cool against her face. She tried to tell herself it was simple, that what she felt was respect, gratitude, maybe admiration. But the truth lingered like the tide, rising quietly no matter how she tried to hold it back. She thought of her late husband, of the love they'd shared steady, familiar, rooted in years of ordinary kindness. What she felt now was different. It wasn't built yet, not even defined. It was something fragile, unnamed, but real enough to unsettle her heart. In the distance, the church bells rang 9 times, soft and low. She watched the reflection of the city shimmer across the water and wondered whether two people, both shaped by loss and pride, could find something true in the fragile space between what was right and what was real. Neither of them knew the answer, but both felt it coming, like a tide they couldn't hold back forever. Because sometimes, the line between work and heart isn't a boundary to cross, it's a mirror, showing two souls what they've been missing and daring them to see it clearly. The line between work and heart had blurred so quietly that neither Clara nor Elliot realized how visible it had become. Their connection, though never spoken aloud, had changed the rhythm of their work. Their meetings carried warmth. Their decisions carried humanity. And yet, in the world they inhabited, warmth could be mistaken for weakness, and humanity could look suspiciously like scandal. At first, everything seemed stable. The Seabrook project had earned cautious optimism from the public. Local leaders began cooperating, and the press printed headlines about Caldwell's new vision for responsible growth. It should have been a season of calm, of progress, but calm never lasts long when power and pride are involved. One Monday morning, the storm broke. It began with a headline on the front page of the Charleston Post Millionaire's Project Threatens Coastal Heritage. Say, activists. By noon, the story had spread across social media, gathering outrage like dry leaves catching fire. Environmental groups accused Caldwell Enterprises of bulldozing protected land. Local historians claimed the project would erase centuries-old Gullah Geechee culture. And at the center of every accusation, every interview, every angry post was Clara Bennett's name, company's PR head, manipulating CEO for her own agenda. One article read, Caldwell's moral makeover staged by a woman who knows which buttons to press. Another claimed, Clara sat in her office that afternoon, the blinds half closed, the light cutting through in pale stripes. Her phone buzzed endlessly, calls from reporters, messages from colleagues, comments she didn't dare read. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the flood of online vitriol. It didn't matter that the accusations weren't true. In the eyes of the world, perception was truth. Marjorie appeared in her doorway, her face heavy with worry. Clara, don't read any more of that nonsense, she said softly. People need someone to blame. Right now, you're the easiest target. Clara looked up, her eyes tired but steady. They're not just blaming me. They're turning the work into something ugly. Everything we tried to build, it's being twisted. Marjorie hesitated, then said quietly, "The board's meeting with him this afternoon. I think they'll want a scapegoat." Clara's breath caught. "You mean?" Marjorie nodded, her silence saying the rest. Upstairs, in the top floor boardroom, Elliot Caldwell faced a semicircle of polished wood, stern faces, and sharpened words. The men and women who had once applauded his vision now questioned his judgment. The news had painted him as a sentimental fool too easily swayed, too distracted by his advisor. "Elliot," one board member said, adjusting his cufflinks, "this entire situation has spiraled because you've allowed personal attachments to cloud professional decisions." Another chimed in. "Public opinion is turning against you. Investors are nervous. If we're to save this project, someone must be held accountable." A pause hung in the room, deliberate, pointed. Then came the inevitable sentence. "We recommend you terminate Ms. Bennett's position immediately." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The men and women around him waited for his compliance after all. That was how things had always worked. But this time, something in him had shifted. He thought of Clara, standing in that community hall, her voice calm, yet firm, listening to people who had never been heard. He thought of the night she'd spoken about her husband, her son, and the courage it took to live by principle in a world that rewarded pretense. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and unlike anything they had heard from him before. "No," he said simply. The room stirred. "Excuse me, I said no. Clara Bennett stays." One of the board members scoffed. "Elliot, this isn't about personal loyalty. It's about salvaging the company's reputation." He met their gaze without flinching. "Our reputation is built on the choices we make when things go wrong. Firing the one person who tried to make this project ethical won't fix anything. It'll just prove our critics right." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Some exchanged glances, others simply stared, unsure how to respond. "Elliot," the chairman began carefully, "you're making a mistake. The press will spin this. They'll assume she has influence over you." "She does," he interrupted quietly. "The right kind." It was the first act of courage inspired not by pride, but by her values. When the meeting ended, Elliot walked back to his office, his steps deliberate. He found Clara still at her desk, the strain visible in her shoulders, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She looked up as he entered. "I know," she said softly. "You don't have to say it. I'll clear out my things." "You're not going anywhere," he said. She blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "What the board wanted you gone," he admitted. "They think you've become a liability." But I told them no. Clara stood slowly, stunned. "Elliot, that could cost you your investors maybe the entire project." "Then so be it," he said. "If doing what's right costs me everything, maybe it's time I finally learn what everything really means." Her throat tightened, emotion pressing at the edges of her composure. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said softly. "I did." For the first time, she saw not the businessman, not the millionaire, but the man he might have been if life had taught him gentleness before success. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted over the city, a fragile, golden calm after the storm. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, the air between them heavy with gratitude, fear, and something too new to name. Clara knew the fight wasn't over. The media would twist this story again. There would be fallout, consequences, endless work to repair what had been broken. But for the first time, she also knew she wasn't standing alone. And Elliot, as he watched her gather her courage once more, realized that respect the kind he had spent a lifetime demanding had finally found its way to him. Not through fear, not through authority, but through the quiet bravery of a woman who taught him that integrity doesn't just change reputations, it changes people. Sometimes the world tries to tear down what is real, but if it's built on truth, It doesn't fall. It stands taller in the storm, its foundation made of something unshakable courage and grace intertwined. In the days that followed, the storm of public scrutiny refused to die down. Headlines still questioned Elliot's judgment. Critics still painted Clara as the woman behind the man's fall from grace. Yet, inside the office, beneath the glare of fluorescent lights and whispered conversations, there was an unspoken solidarity between them. Elliot stood by her. She, in turn, stood taller because of it. But courage, no matter how noble, often carries its own weight. And when two people carry that weight together, the line between gratitude and something deeper begins to blur. It started with a disagreement, a small one at first. A new article had reignited the controversy, this time targeting local permits. Elliot wanted to go public with a statement of defiance. Clara urged caution. "Fighting louder won't fix this," she said, her tone calm but firm. "And silence," Willie shot back. "They're twisting everything we've done. If I don't speak, they'll assume we're guilty." She met his eyes steadily. "Sometimes the only way to earn trust is to stop defending and start listening again. You taught me that once." The words hit their mark, sharp and true. For a moment, he said nothing. The sound of rain began tapping faintly against the tall windows, soft at first, then steadier, like a rhythm neither of them could ignore. Elliot turned away, his voice tight. "You think I don't listen? You think I haven't been trying. I think you're scared," Clara said quietly. "Scared that all of this, the respect, the redemption could vanish the moment people stop believing in you." He turned back to her then, his eyes flashing. "And what about you, Clara? What are you afraid of? That you've believed in me too much?" Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The storm outside grew heavier, rattling the glass as if to remind them both that honesty has its price. "I'm not afraid of believing in you," she said at last. "I'm afraid of losing myself while I do." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. She gathered her things with trembling hands, unwilling to let him see the tears forming in her eyes. "I can't do this right now," she whispered. "Not like this." "Clara," he began, but she was already gone. Outside, the sky had turned to slate. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking the city streets, blurring the lights of Charleston into watercolor. Clara walked without direction, her heels splashing through puddles, her mind spinning. Every step away from the office felt like peeling back a layer of her own restraint layers she had kept for so long to remain composed, professional, untouchable. But beneath all that composure was exhaustion and longing and a loneliness she hadn't let herself feel in years. She found herself near the pier, the one overlooking the dark stretch of water that reached toward the Atlantic. The storm was fierce now, the kind that seemed to wash away not just the day, but everything you hadn't said. She stood there under the deluge, her hair clinging to her face, her breath visible in the cool, salt-heavy air. Behind her came the sound of hurried footsteps. She didn't turn. "Clara." She closed her eyes briefly. Of course he'd come. When she turned, Elliot was there, his coat drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expression raw, stripped of all the polish that usually guarded him. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice raised over the storm. "Neither should you," she answered. He took a few steps closer, his shoes splashing through the rising puddles. "You just walked out," he said. "You can't do that, not after everything we've built." Her laugh broke through the rain, fragile but real. "Everything we've built, Elliot. I don't even know what we means anymore. Is it the project? The company? Or this thing between us that we pretend doesn't exist?" He stopped inches from her, his breath uneven. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know I can't stand there and watch you walk away again." Lightning flared in the distance, illuminating the water behind them in a brief, silver flash. For the first time, he looked truly vulnerable, not the man of headlines and power, but a man stripped bare of everything except truth. "I spent my whole life fighting not to need anyone," he said. "Needing people meant weakness. It meant risk. But then you came along, and suddenly He broke off, shaking his head as if the words themselves defied him. You make me want to be the kind of man I used to think didn't exist. The rain pounded harder, blurring their outlines into shadow and light. Clara's heart ached at the sight of him, this man she had challenged, clashed with, changed. You can't say things like that, she said softly. Not if you don't mean them. I mean every word, he said. Her tears mingled with the rain. Then why does it feel like I'm the one paying for your redemption? He stepped closer, his voice low. Because you're the only person who's ever asked me to earn it. Something in her broke then, not in pain, but in release. All the tension, the restraint, the pretending it fell away in that downpour. She reached for him as he reached for her, their hands finding each other in a moment that was both inevitable and forbidden. When he kissed her, it wasn't careful or rehearsed. It was the collision of everything they had held back: anger, fear, longing, and the strange, aching relief of being seen. The rain washed over them, relentless and cold, but neither pulled away. It was raw, it was human, it was real. When they finally parted, breathless, the storm had quieted to a steady drizzle. Neither spoke. Words felt too small for what had just broken open between them. Clara looked out over the dark water, her heart still trembling. What happens now, she asked. Elliot's answer came after a long pause. I don't know, he said honestly, but for once, I'm not afraid to find out. They stood there in silence, the pier stretching out before them, the city behind them fading into mist. The rain kept falling, gentle now, like forgiveness descending from the sky. And though no one saw them, and no promise was spoken, something sacred passed between them, something not bound by titles or roles or circumstance, but by truth itself. Because sometimes it takes a storm to strip us of everything we hide behind, until all that's left is who we really are and the quiet courage to reach for what we can no longer deny. The night of the storm left both of them changed. Neither Clara nor Elliot spoke of what happened by the pier, yet every glance, every pause, carried the memory of it. In the quiet days that followed, they worked side by side as if nothing had shifted, reviewing plans, attending meetings, exchanging calm, professional words, but beneath the surface, something tender and uncertain pulsed between them. They told themselves they could manage it, that their feelings, like the rain, had come and gone. But love, once awakened, doesn't vanish. It waits, patient and unyielding, in the silence between heartbeats. By the time the first rumors appeared, the city was already restless. Photographs began circulating, grainy shots of them, leaving the office late together, standing too close at the waterfront, a shadow of intimacy captured by someone's lens. The headlines followed quickly: Caldwell's secret affair, charity, or scandal. The woman behind Charleston's most controversial project. At first, Clara tried to ignore it. She told herself people would move on, that gossip would fade as it always did. But it didn't. It grew. Whispers followed her through the hallways now. The same colleagues who had once respected her quiet strength looked at her with pity or, worse, judgment. Even the elevator rides seemed longer, heavier. One afternoon, Marjorie closed the office door behind her and stood before Clara's desk. Her kind eyes were clouded with worry. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you know I love you like family, but this talk that's going around, it's getting ugly." "I know," Clara said quietly, setting down her pen. Marjorie sighed. "You've worked too hard to let them drag your name through the mud. You need to protect your integrity, even if it means stepping back for a while." Clara looked at her, torn. Stepping back feels like admitting they're right. "Sometimes," Marjorie said gently, "it's not about what's right. It's about what's left of you when the world's done talking." The words lingered. That night, Clara sat in her small living room, the lamp casting a warm pool of light over the framed photographs on her shelf. Her late husband's smile, her son Owen's graduation portrait. Her heart ached with the weight of choices that seemed impossible. She loved Elliot, though she hadn't said it, and maybe never would. But she also loved her self-respect, the integrity that had carried her through every storm of her life. And now, it felt like the two were pulling her in opposite directions. Meanwhile, in the glass tower of Caldwell Enterprises, another storm was brewing. The board had called an emergency meeting. When Elliot entered the room, the tension was immediate, sharp, metallic. The faces around the table were cold, expectant. "Elliot," the chairman began, "this situation has gone too far. The press won't let go of this narrative. Investors are threatening to pull funding. The company's reputation is on the line." Elliot said nothing, only folded his hands on the table and waited. "You need to make a decision," another board member pressed. "Either you end this association, or you risk losing everything we've built." "Association," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word. "Is that what you think this is? What else could it be?" Someone snapped. "You've allowed this woman to influence your decisions, compromise your objectivity, and now the public sees you as distracted and weak." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. For years, he had ruled these rooms with precision and control. But now, as he looked around, he saw what he'd built more clearly than ever, an empire of profit, yes, but also of fear, fear of vulnerability, fear of truth. He rose slowly. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly, "but I won't fire Clara Bennett." The room erupted in disbelief. "Elliot, be reasonable. You're gambling with the company, she's destroying your credibility." He waited for the voices to die down, then spoke again calmly, but with the unmistakable weight of conviction. "For years, you've told me that respect comes from power, from control, from never bending, but you're wrong. Respect comes from honesty, from the courage to stand for something when it costs you everything." One of the board members scoffed. "And what is she to you? A cause woman who makes you feel noble?" Elliot's gaze hardened. "She's the only person who's ever made me look in the mirror and not hate what I see." The room went still. No one spoke. He knew what his words meant. He knew the cost. By choosing truth, he was choosing to lose control, favor, maybe even his empire. But for the first time in his life, the loss didn't terrify him. It freed him. When the meeting ended, he walked out of the boardroom without waiting for their verdict. In the hallway, his assistant handed him an envelope, another article, another hit piece filled with half-truths and insinuations. He barely looked at it. Instead, he found himself heading toward Clara's office, guided not by logic, but by something deeper. She was standing by the window when he arrived, her reflection caught in the glass, looking out at the rain that had started again. "They want me gone, don't they?" she asked quietly, not turning. "Yes," he admitted. "And you?" "I told them no." She turned then, her eyes shining with a mix of disbelief and fear. "Elliot, you can't. I already did," he said. "I told them the truth, about you, about us." Her breath caught. "That could ruin you?" "Maybe," he said, "but living a lie already has." The air between them was thick with everything they couldn't undo. Clara wanted to tell him this wasn't worth it, that no love, no truth, was worth watching someone lose everything. But she saw it in his eyes. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the man he was finally becoming. The man who had once measured success in skyscrapers and signatures was now learning that the greatest measure of all was integrity, the kind that asks for nothing and costs everything. Outside, the storm gathered again, dark clouds rolling over the harbor. But this time, neither of them flinched, because some storms aren't meant to destroy. They come to wash away what no longer belongs, to leave behind only what's real, what's worth saving. And in that truth, costly as it was, there was a kind of peace neither had known before. After the boardroom confrontation, everything began to unravel quietly at first, like a seam loosening beneath the weight of too many unspoken truths. Word spread through the company that Elliot Caldwell had defied his board, refused their demands, and chosen integrity over image. To the outside world, it looked like madness. To Clara, it looked like courage. But courage doesn't pay the bills or steady the markets. Within weeks, investors began to withdraw. Partners distanced themselves. News outlets ran stories with words like collapse, crisis, downfall. The Seabrook Project, once the symbol of progress and possibility, was suddenly branded a failure. Clara watched it all unfold from the sidelines, her chest tightening with every headline. The guilt gnawed at her quietly, day after day, until it became a constant ache she couldn't ignore. She had tried to protect the truth. She had stood for what was right. But now, the cost of that honesty was becoming painfully real. One afternoon, she sat in her office packing up the last of her files. The building, once filled with movement and noise, now felt hollow. Half the staff had been reassigned or let go. The project's temporary shutdown had emptied the halls of ambition and replaced it with the fragile sound of endings. Marjorie stopped by the doorway, eyes soft but tired. "He's in his office," she said gently. "You should talk to him before you go." Clara nodded, her heart heavy. When she reached his door, she found it slightly ajar. Elliot stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the Charleston skyline. Papers were scattered across his desks, contracts voided, statements from investors, the debris of an empire in free fall. He didn't turn when she entered. "You're leaving," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I think it's best," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I stay, it'll only make things harder. For both of us." He finally turned to face her. His eyes, though tired, still held the depth of someone who had learned to look at life differently. "You think walking away will make the noise stop?" She smiled faintly. "No, but maybe it'll help you rebuild, without me being a reminder of how much was lost." He took a slow step toward her. "Lost," he repeated, almost as if testing the word. "That's what everyone keeps saying, that I've lost everything. Investors, status, control." "You have," she said gently, "and it's because of me." He shook his head. "No, Clara, it's because of me. Because I believed that control was the same thing as success. That power meant respect." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "You don't have to make this easier for me." "I'm not," he said. "I'm telling you the truth. You didn't ruin me." He paused, his voice deepening, soft but steady. "You saved me from becoming my worst self." The words hung in the air between them, tender and painful at once. Clara turned away for a moment, her hands trembling. "Elliot." He stepped closer. "Look at me," he said. When she did, she saw it clearly, the humility in his eyes. The man stripped of everything but his humanity. The man who, for the first time, had nothing left to prove. "I don't know what happens next," he said. "The company will survive, maybe smaller, maybe it won't. But I know this, what you taught me. I can't unlearn. You showed me that leadership isn't about being feared. It's about being worthy of trust." Tears filled her eyes. "And yet, here we are, standing in the wreckage of everything we built. Maybe some things have to break," he said softly, "so the right pieces can finally fit." They stood there in the fading light, two people caught between love and consequence, truth and loss. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting long shadows across the floor, like time itself, reminding them that every beginning must someday give way to an ending. Clara took a deep breath. "You'll be okay," she said, trying to sound certain. "You've always found a way to rebuild." He smiled, but it was a quiet, wounded smile. "Only because people like you believed I could." She stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve. "You don't need me to believe in you anymore. Elliot, you've learned how to do that yourself." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of ache, of every word they'd never dared to say aloud. When she finally turned to leave, he didn't stop her. He simply watched her go, his heart heavy yet strangely at peace. At the elevator, Clara paused for one last look. Through the glass, she could see him still standing there, framed by the light of a setting sun. For a fleeting moment, she wished things had been different, that the world had been kinder, that timing had been gentler. But deep down, She knew this parting wasn't failure. It was the final act of respect. As the elevator doors closed, she whispered a quiet prayer, not for herself, but for him, for strength, for clarity, for the man who had learned that integrity, once found, was worth any price. Later that evening, Elliot remained in his office long after darkness fell. The city lights flickered below, their reflections glimmering across the glass like distant stars. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invincible. He felt alive. He poured a small drink, though he didn't touch it, and walked to the window. Somewhere out there, Clara was beginning again, just as he would have to. And though they were apart, he felt no bitterness, only gratitude. She had entered his life like a quiet storm, uprooting what was hollow, washing away what was false. And now, in the stillness that followed, something inside him had begun to grow again, something real, something steady. Because sometimes, the breaking point isn't the end of the story. It's the place where the light finally finds its way in. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the deepest wounds. Months slipped quietly by after Clara walked out of Caldwell Enterprises for the last time. What had once been a life of hurried meetings, bright headlines, and the constant hum of ambition was replaced with something slower, smaller but gentler. By early spring, she had settled in Savannah, a few hours south of Charleston. The city, with its oak-lined streets and slow tides, welcomed her with a quiet kind of grace. She had taken a position with a small non-profit organization that worked to preserve coastal communities' modest work compared to the grandeur of Elliot's empire, but meaningful in ways that spoke directly to her soul. Her days were filled with the kind of rhythm she hadn't known in years. Morning coffee on her porch as the sun lifted over the river. Long drives down narrow roads to meet fishermen, teachers, and families trying to keep their small corners of the world alive. There was no boardroom here, no power struggle, only purpose. Still, there were moments when the quiet pressed too close, when the sound of her own footsteps on the wooden floors of her small house echoed like memory. She hadn't heard from Elliot since their parting. He had vanished from the headlines almost overnight. The world, ever hungry for novelty, had moved on to newer stories, new successes, new scandals. The once mighty Caldwell Enterprises now existed only in the occasional footnote of a business column. Some said he'd left the city entirely. Others claimed he was rebuilding in silence. Clara didn't ask. She didn't need to know the details. And yet, some evenings, as she walked along the Savannah River and watched the water catch the dying light, she found herself thinking of him not with longing, exactly, but with a kind of ache that was both tender and inevitable. She remembered his voice, low and rough, the night he'd said, "You didn't ruin it. You saved me from becoming my worst self." She wondered if he still believed that. There were days she missed him deeply, the conversation, the quiet tension, even the arguments that had once exhausted her, but always led to something honest. She missed the way his presence had filled a room, the way he had begun to listen, really listen, as though hearing people for the first time in his life. But she also knew that what they'd shared wasn't meant to last. It had been a turning point, not a destination, a meeting of two souls that helped each other find a mirror, then a door. She was still learning what to do with the emptiness he'd left behind. At first, she tried to fill it with work, with causes, with the endless motion of doing good. But eventually, she realized that not every space is meant to be filled. Some are meant to be felt, to be honored, to be lived in quietly until they teach you something about yourself. One evening, after a long day at the community center, Clara sat on a weathered bench in Forsyth Park. The air smelled faintly of magnolia and rain. A group of children played nearby, chasing one another beneath the dripping trees, their laughter carrying across the damp air. She watched them and smiled, feeling something inside her ease. A thought drifted through her mind, clear and unexpected. Peace doesn't always come when life is full. Sometimes it arrives only when life becomes still enough to hear it breathe. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the river, the pulse of her own heart. For years, she had lived in noise, Noise of ambition, of expectation, of love complicated by fear. Now, the silence was her teacher. At home, her evenings were simple. She'd cook dinner for one, light a candle on the table, and read until the words blurred into calm. Occasionally, her son Owen called from college, his voice carrying laughter and energy that made her chest swell with pride. He always asked how she was doing, and she always said, "I'm good, sweetheart." And she meant it, because she was learning something she hadn't understood. Before solitude isn't the absence of love, it's the space where love learns how to breathe on its own. Sometimes she wondered if Elliot had found that same peace. She liked to imagine him somewhere quiet, maybe by the water, maybe listening to an old jazz record the way he used to, learning how to live without the armor of success. She hoped he'd found a kind of forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself. One late afternoon, she received a letter. No return address, just her name written in familiar, careful handwriting. Inside, only a short note. "Clara, I'm rebuilding, not the company, but something far more important. I wanted you to know that your voice still echoes in the choices I make. I'm learning to build slower this time, and kinder. Thank you for reminding me that some things, once broken, can still grow back better. E." She read it twice, her heart both heavy and light. There was no invitation, no promise, just truth, and it was enough. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cicadas began their song, Clara stood by her window, looking out at the world that had become her new beginning. She wasn't waiting for him to return, nor for any grand closure. Life, she realized, doesn't always tie itself into neat endings. Sometimes it simply softens, opening into something wiser. The spaces that once felt empty now held meaning. They were not voids, but vessels, places where memory and gratitude quietly coexisted. And in that stillness, she found what she had been searching for all along. Peace not in the noise of being needed, not in the rush of success, and not even in love returned, but in the steady, unwavering truth that she was whole on her own. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a heart can do after breaking is learn how to beat gently again. Spring arrived in Savannah quietly that year. The azaleas bloomed early, filling the air with a sweetness that seemed almost forgiving. By then, Clara's life had settled into a calm rhythm, a simplicity that once might have frightened her, but now felt like peace. She had grown used to mornings without urgency, to evenings marked only by the steady hum of crickets outside her window. The ache she once carried had softened into something gentler, a quiet acceptance that not all love stories are meant to end in togetherness. Some are meant to awaken you to guide you back to yourself. Yet life, in its tender wisdom, often finds ways to circle back when hearts are ready. It happened on a Tuesday, just after lunch. Clara was sorting through a stack of grant applications at the nonprofit office when her assistant brought her a small envelope, cream-colored, with her name written in the familiar, precise handwriting she hadn't seen in almost a year. Her breath caught as she turned it over. The return address read simply, "The Caldwell Foundation." Inside was a short letter. "Clara, I've started something new, a public foundation focused on affordable housing and community renewal. No investors, no shareholders, just purpose. I learned from the best what real progress looks like. Would you consider meeting with me? I'd like to talk not about the past, but about what comes next." E. She read it 3 times before setting it down. The room seemed to blur for a moment, filled with echoes of memory, rain on the pier, his voice steady in the storm, the quiet look in his eyes when they'd last said goodbye. For a long while, she didn't move. Then she exhaled slowly, folded the letter, and slipped it into her bag. 2 days later, she drove north toward Charleston. The highway stretched ahead beneath a soft blue sky, the marshes gleaming like mirrors on either side. The miles passed quietly, her heart alternating between calm and apprehension. She wasn't sure what she was walking into or who she would find waiting. When she reached the city, it felt both familiar and foreign. The skyline was the same, but the weight it once carried in her chest had lifted. She parked near the waterfront, where a new building stood, a modest, light-filled structure of glass and reclaimed wood. Above the entrance, the sign read, "The Caldwell Foundation for Community Renewal." Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paint. Photos lined the walls, smiling families, restored homes, neighborhoods reborn through cooperation rather than conquest. It wasn't the world Elliot Caldwell had once ruled. It was the world he'd finally learned to build. He was waiting for her in the main conference room, standing near the window. Time had changed him, but not unkindly. The sharp edges of power had softened into something humbler. His hair was a little grayer, his posture less rigid, but his presence steady, grounded, remained unmistakable. "Clara," he said quietly, turning toward her. She smiled, small but sincere. "Elliot." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was full of history of things said and things forgiven. Then, with the same quiet grace that had once disarmed him, she broke the silence. "You've been busy." He smiled faintly. Busy trying to make amends. The world didn't need another luxury developer. It needed someone willing to listen. She glanced around the room, the sunlight catching on the framed photo of a family standing in front of a newly built house. "It's beautiful. Not just the building, the purpose." He nodded, his gaze steady. "You taught me that purpose matters more than ambition." He paused. "That people matter more than profit." Clara looked at him then, not as the man who had once broken her heart, but as someone who had finally learned what it meant to heal. "And what do you need from me, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked softly, though there was warmth in her tone. "Collaboration," he said. "Your experience with community trust is exactly what this foundation needs. But more than that." He hesitated. "I need someone who will keep me honest." Her smile deepened, touched with understanding. "Still afraid of becoming your worst self every day," he admitted. "But now I know that fear's not weakness. It's awareness." They both laughed then, the kind of laugh that carried no bitterness, only relief. The meeting stretched into hours, discussions of projects, partnerships, visions for rebuilding neighborhoods that had long been forgotten. But beneath the professional exchange was something deeper, quieter. Not rekindled romance, not yet, but the unmistakable hum of connection renewed. When they finally stepped outside, the sun was low over the harbor. The wind carried the familiar scent of salt and magnolia. They walked together along the boardwalk, the conversation slowing until it became something gentler than words. "I used to think redemption was about undoing mistakes," Elliot said. "But maybe it's just about learning to live with them and choosing differently the next time." Clara looked out over the water, her voice soft but sure. "Redemption isn't earned in grand gestures. It's found in quiet choices that build something lasting." He nodded. "Then maybe we're both learning." They stood in silence for a while, the sky glowing with the soft gold of evening. Around them, life went on, families laughing, children chasing seagulls, the city breathing as if it too had forgiven its past. When he finally turned to her, his eyes held something tender but unhurried. "I didn't ask you here to start over," he said. "I just wanted to show you what your belief made possible." She smiled, her gaze steady. And maybe that's what starting over really means. For the first time in years, Clara felt no confusion, no ache of unfinished love, only gratitude. Gratitude for what had been, for what was, and for the rare gift of seeing someone she once helped find his way again. As they parted at the end of the pier, there were no promises, no declarations, just the quiet certainty that both had come full circle. And in that calm, as the last light shimmered across the water, Clara realized that redemption doesn't always arrive as a second chance at love. Sometimes, it's the peace that follows when two souls, once lost in ambition and pain, finally learn how to build something good side by side, but free. Because true healing, like the tide, doesn't rush back. It returns slowly, faithfully, until the shore feels whole again. In the months that followed their quiet reunion, life began to take on a new rhythm, one that neither Clara nor Elliot could have predicted, yet both had somehow been preparing for all along. What started as a professional collaboration slowly became something deeper, a rebuilding of trust, of shared purpose. And though neither dared name it at first of love, Clara accepted Elliot's invitation to join the foundation, not as an employee, but as a partner. They work side by side now, their desks separated only by sunlight spilling across polished wood. The hierarchy that had once defined their relationship was gone. What remained was a quality and unspoken understanding that they had both earned their place in this new chapter. The Caldwell Foundation for Community Renewal began to thrive. In less than a year, they had helped construct affordable housing for over 200 families. Streets that had once been forgotten came alive again. Children's laughter echoing through newly painted doorways. Gardens blooming where there had once been empty lots. The local paper called it the Quiet Revolution, led not by profit, but by empathy. Clara often found herself watching the way Elliot worked now. The man who had once filled boardrooms with command now listened, really listened to every person in the room. He asked questions. He invited dissent. He learned the names of construction workers, of single mothers applying for housing grants, of volunteers who arrived each weekend with paint-stained hands and open hearts. It humbled her, this transformation. There was still the same determination in him, but it had softened no longer a weapon, but a tool for doing good. His edges had been worn down by the lessons of loss, by the grace of change, and watching him, she couldn't help but see not the man he had been, but the one he had become, human, grounded, kind. One late afternoon, as the sun lowered over the city, they stood side by side at the site of a nearly finished housing project. Children ran through the open courtyards, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic sound of hammers and saws. Elliot handed her a cup of coffee, the way he often did now, without words. "They look happy," he said, nodding toward the families unpacking boxes into their new homes. "They are," Clara replied, "because for once, someone built something that wasn't meant to take from them." He smiled, a quiet pride flickering in his eyes. "You were right all along. You know, progress isn't about building higher, it's about building together." Clara turned to look at him. "And you were brave enough to make that real." For a long moment, neither spoke. The orange light of evening stretched between them, soft and forgiving. That night, the foundation hosted a small celebration for the project's completion. The community hall was filled with the smell of homemade food, the hum of conversation, and music that drifted gently through open windows. It wasn't a glamorous event. No photographers, no press, just people, gathered in gratitude. Clara sat at a corner table, watching Elliot as he moved among the crowd. He stopped to talk with an elderly couple whose home had just been rebuilt, knelt to speak with a child, showing him a crayon drawing of Mr. Elliot's house, and laughed in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. And in that laughter, she saw it the man she had always believed he could become. When he finally joined her at the table, the night was winding down, the candles burned low, and the sound of music softened to a hum. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked quietly. "All the time," she said, "though I'm not sure I ever imagined it would feel like this." "Like what?" She looked around the room at the families dancing, the smiles, the shared joy. "Like peace," she said, "like redemption." He nodded slowly. "You gave me that." She shook her head. "No, Elliot, you found it yourself. I just reminded you where to look." He smiled, the kind of smile that carried years within it. "You always did." A comfortable silence settled between them then, filled with everything they didn't need to say. Respect, the foundation on which they had rebuilt everything, had transformed into something richer, something rooted not in admiration alone, but in love that had weathered storms, survived distance, and grown patient enough to wait for its right season. When the evening ended, they walked outside together. The air was cool, fragrant with jasmine, the sky painted with the last streaks of twilight. The city stretched before them, not perfect, but healing. "Do you ever miss the old days?" Clara asked suddenly. He thought for a moment. "Sometimes I miss the certainty," he admitted, "but then I remember certainty doesn't always mean peace. Back then, I was powerful but empty. Now, I'm smaller but whole." She smiled softly. "That's a kind of success they don't measure in dollars." He looked at her, his voice low. "It's the only kind that lasts." They walked slowly toward their cars, their footsteps in easy rhythm. At the corner, he turned to her and said, almost as an afterthought, "Clara, you once told me respect begins with empathy. I didn't understand it then, but now I think empathy begins with love, the kind that sees someone completely and still stays." Her eyes met his, shining. "And you stayed," she said simply. He nodded, and in that moment, something passed between them, soft as forgiveness, strong as truth. It wasn't the passionate spark of their first connection, nor the painful longing that had followed. It was quieter, steadier, born from years of learning, of breaking, of rebuilding. It was love that no longer needed to be proven. It just was. As the night deepened, the city lights reflected across the river like scattered stars. They stood for a moment, watching the water move slow, steady, certain. And in that stillness, they both understood that this was what it meant to rebuild, not to erase the past, but to honor it. Not to begin again, but to continue together, in trust, in kindness, in love that had finally come home. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't end in applause. It ends in quiet partnership. Two souls, standing side by side, building something that will outlast them both. The following spring arrived with a kind of quiet triumph. The city had begun to whisper about the Caldwell Foundation, not as a redemption story, but as a living example of how change could ripple outward when pride gave way to compassion. What started as a single project in Charleston had now grown into a statewide movement renovating old neighborhoods, restoring dignity, and reminding people that progress could still have a heart. For Elliot and Clara, the work had become not just a mission, but a reflection of everything they had learned. Their days were filled with plans and people, site visits and laughter. They no longer spoke much about the past. It had softened into something understood, forgiven. They were simply two souls working in harmony, the way good music doesn't need words to stay in tune. Now, the foundation was preparing for its official public launch, a gathering meant to celebrate not just the opening of a new headquarters, but the spirit of rebuilding that had come to define them. The event would bring together community leaders, families whose lives had been changed, and local press eager to tell a story that wasn't about scandal or power, but grace. The night before the ceremony, Clara and Elliot walked through the new building, making final checks. It was a space designed to breathe open hallways, warm light, and walls lined with photographs of people, not numbers. Clara paused before one photo of a small boy standing proudly on the porch of his new home. "Do you remember his family?" she asked. Elliot nodded. "The Garcias. His mother works at the community center now. She told me last week her son wants to be an architect." Clara smiled. "That's what this is about. Not us. Them." He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You've always known that." The next afternoon, the hall filled with people. Some wore suits, others jeans and work boots. There was laughter, chatter, the hum of anticipation. The air felt alive, like hope itself had pulled up a chair. Clara stood near the back, wanting to give him space. She had seen Elliot speak 100 times before back when he was the man of headlines and marble stages. But this felt different. There was no podium of ego here, no spotlight of grandeur, just a wooden lectern, a crowd that cared, and a man who had learned to speak from somewhere deeper than ambition. When he took the stage, the room quieted. He paused, taking a slow breath, his gaze sweeping across faces that now felt like family. "I used to think success was measured by what we built," he began. "By the towers that touch the sky, by the size of a bank account, by the sound of applause. But the truth is, I built a lot of things that never lasted because they weren't made with empathy. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone who had lived both sides of his own story. I've been the man who chased approval, who mistook respect for fear. I've made choices that hurt people, people I cared about, even when I didn't know how to show it. But if life has taught me anything, it's that real change doesn't come from strength. It comes from humility, from listening, from learning to see others fully. He paused, his hand tightening on the lectern. This foundation isn't mine. It belongs to every person who believed that doing good doesn't require perfection, just intention. And it exists because of one person who taught me something I had forgotten. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Clara in the crowd. For a moment, the world seemed to still. She once told me, he continued, that if you want respect, you start by giving it. At the time, I didn't understand. I thought respect was something you demanded. But she was right. It's something you earn. And you earn it by choosing empathy over pride, truth over comfort, and people over power. A hush fell over the room. His voice trembled not from nerves, but from emotion that no speechwriter could have prepared. So, today, I dedicate this foundation not to a cause or a company, but to a woman who reminded me that respect begins with kindness, and that kindness, when it's real, can rebuild the world. He stopped, his words catching. For a long moment, he didn't speak at all. He simply stood there, head bowed slightly, as if holding the silence was the only way to honor what had just been said. The audience rose to their feet in quiet applause, not loud or frantic, but steady and full of heart. Clara felt her throat tighten as she watched him step back from the microphone, his expression unguarded, almost vulnerable. She had always admired his strength, his drive, but this moment showed her something she'd never seen before, a man completely at peace with his truth. After the ceremony, the sun dipped low over Charleston, bathing the waterfront in golden light. Guests lingered, talking softly, their faces warm with something that felt bigger than celebration. Clara stepped outside, needing a breath of air. She found herself on the terrace overlooking the river. The water shimmered, reflecting the glow of lanterns hung for the evening reception. She heard footsteps behind her, then his voice. "You disappeared again," Elliot said gently. She smiled without turning. "I wanted to see it from a distance. It's beautiful, Elliot, all of it." He joined her at the railing. "You made it beautiful." She shook her head. "No, you did. You chose to change. That's the hardest thing anyone can do." He was quiet for a moment, watching the light dance on the water. "When I stood up there today, I thought about how far we've come. Not just me, but us, the foundation, the people, the city." He glanced at her, his expression soft. "But mostly, I thought about how much I still owe you." She turned toward him then, her voice tender. "You don't owe me anything. Elliot, you paid it forward in every life you've helped rebuild." He smiled, and for a brief, silent moment, they stood there as the evening breeze carried the faint sound of laughter from inside. The city was alive again, reborn through their shared work. But more than that, they were alive again, two people who had once collided through pride and pain, now standing side by side in quiet grace. As the last light faded, Clara felt a deep calm settle over her. She realized that this moment of stillness, of gratitude, was the truest kind of love, the kind that doesn't demand or declare, but simply exists. Because sometimes, the most powerful speeches are not the ones that move crowds, but the ones that heal the hearts that once stood apart and finally found their way back, together. After the applause faded and the last guest drifted home, the evening settled into a calm that felt almost sacred. The lanterns along the terrace still glowed softly, their reflections trembling on the water like small, lingering memories. The city had grown quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only after something meaningful has been said and received. Clara stood near the edge of the foundation's courtyard, her shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The warmth of the day had given way to a cool night breeze that carried the faint scent of jasmine and rain. Behind her, the staff was cleaning up laughter and clinking glasses echoing faintly through the open doors. She heard footsteps approach, but didn't need to turn. She knew that sound. "Everyone's gone," Elliot said, his voice low, gentle. She smiled faintly. "So it's just us, then just us," he repeated. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it. For a long while, they stood in silence, the night stretching easy and unhurried between them. Then Elliot gestured toward the street. "There's a small place a few blocks from here serves the best seafood in Charleston. Would you let me buy you dinner?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Dinner sounds nice." They walked together through the quiet streets, the glow of old gas lamps flickering above them. The restaurant he mentioned was small, tucked between a bookshop and a flower stand closing for the night. Inside, the air was warm, the light golden. The waiter recognized Elliot. Everyone in Charleston still did, but there was no formality in the greeting, only familiarity. They chose a corner table by the window. The world outside moved at a slow rhythm, cars passing, laughter drifting, the hum of life continuing. For a while, they spoke of small things. The success of the launch, the families who had attended, the project still waiting to begin. Their words were light, but their silences carried something deeper, an ease that comes only after storms have passed. When the waiter left them alone again, Elliot leaned back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "You know," he began, "I've given a lot of speeches in my life, but today felt different." Clara smiled softly. "Because it was." He nodded, his gaze lowering for a moment. "I meant every word I said. You changed the way I see everything, not just business, but people, myself. Maybe," she said, "you just started seeing what was always there." He looked up again, the corner of his mouth curving. "You give me too much credit, and you still don't give yourself enough." Their eyes met across the small table, and for a heartbeat, the years of distance and struggle dissolved. There was only this two people who had hurt, learned, forgiven, and found their way back to a kind of peace that didn't need to be named. Elliot's voice softened. "You taught me to build something that lasts," he said. "Not buildings, not wealth, but trust." Clara's breath caught at the quiet honesty of it. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, with that calm steadiness he had always admired, she said, "And you taught me it's okay to love again." The words hung between them, not heavy, but tender like truth finally given permission to rest. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The gesture was simple, unhurried. It wasn't a declaration, it was recognition. For years, their story had been built on tension-clashing wills, broken pride, impossible choices. But now, everything had quieted into something far more beautiful. Love, not as fire, but as light steady, unburning, enough to see by. After dinner, they walked along the waterfront. The city was hushed except for the sound of waves lapping against the docks and the faint strains of music from a bar down the street. The air smelled of salt and possibility. "Do you ever think," Clara said softly, "about how differently things could have gone?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I think if we hadn't broken, we wouldn't have learned how to rebuild. Not the project, not the foundation, ourselves." She nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what life really is, breaking and rebuilding, over and over, until we finally learn what's worth keeping." He smiled, glancing at her, "And what's worth letting go." They reached the pier, the same one where months ago they'd stood in the rain angry, heartbroken, lost. Now, the night was still, the water calm. The past didn't sting anymore. It had softened into memory, like sea glass smoothed by years of tide. Elliot rested his hands on the railing, looking out over the water. "You know," he said quietly, "for a long time, I thought success meant never losing control. Now I think the truest kind of success is learning when to surrender." She looked at him, her voice gentle. "You surrendered beautifully." He laughed softly, the sound carrying across the dark water. Only because someone showed me how. They stood there a while longer, watching the lights of the harbor shimmer in the distance. Words were no longer needed. Everything that mattered had already been said. Eventually, Clara turned toward him. "It's getting late," she said. He nodded. "I'll walk you to your car." At the corner, they stopped. The streetlights painted their faces in a soft amber glow. She turned to him, and for a moment, he saw the woman who had once challenged him in front of a crowded ballroom, the same fire, the same grace, but gentler now, anchored in wisdom. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying true to who you are. Even when I wasn't," she smiled. "And thank you for finally catching up." He laughed quietly, and in that sound, she heard peace, the kind that comes when two paths, after years of winding through chaos, finally converge in stillness. "Good night." "Elliot," she said softly. "Good night." "Clara." She turned, walking toward her car, her steps steady. When she reached the end of the street, she looked back once more. He was still standing there, hands in his pockets, watching her go, not with longing, but with gratitude. And maybe that was the truest ending their story could have. Not a promise, not a grand declaration, but a quiet understanding between two people who had already said everything through the lives they chose to live. Because love, in its purest form, doesn't always demand forever. Sometimes, it simply asks for peace and the grace to recognize when you've finally found it. The seasons turn gently, as they always do when life begins to heal itself. 1 year had passed since that quiet dinner, since the night when Clara and Elliot had parted ways not as lovers or partners, but as two souls finally at peace with where their paths had led them. And in that year, the world around them seemed to bloom again slowly, purposefully, like the earth remembering how to breathe after a long winter. The Caldwell Foundation for Community Renewal had become something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. What began as a single project in Charleston had now grown into a movement spreading across the state. Abandoned houses were being transformed into homes, neglected parks into safe places for children to play, and forgotten corners of the city into gardens of shared hope. The local newspaper called it a revolution of respect. But those who had witnessed its beginnings knew better. It wasn't a revolution at all. It was a restoration of faith, of dignity, of the simple truth that people thrive when they are seen, not judged. Clara still worked with the foundation, though now she split her time between Charleston and Savannah. Her days were full, yet never frantic. She had learned the art of living slowly, of letting meaning guide her pace. And though her life was content on its own, there were moments quiet, unannounced, when the thought of Elliot would rise like a soft tide, steady and familiar. He had changed too. The once impenetrable businessman had become something of a local legend, though not for wealth or status. People now spoke of Elliot Caldwell as a man of integrity, a builder of trust rather than towers. When he walked through a neighborhood, children waved, and adults nodded not out of reverence, but of respect, the kind that couldn't be bought, only earned. It was late afternoon when Clara returned to Charleston that spring, her train rolling along the marshlands gilded by the lowering sun. She had been invited to attend the Foundation's first anniversary celebration, an event that wasn't meant to dazzle, but to thank. When she arrived at the waterfront, the sight before her took her breath for a moment. The old harbor, once gray and silent, now hummed with life. Vendors sold fresh flowers, street musicians played soft jazz, and the buildings along the water gleamed with the care of a city rediscovering pride. She spotted Elliot near the pier, speaking with a group of volunteers. He looked much the same, his hair a touch grayer, his posture less rigid, but there was something profoundly different about his presence. It carried ease now, not command. When he saw her, his expression warmed with that quiet recognition that needs no words. "Clara," he said simply. As she approached, "Elliot," she replied, smiling. "You've done well." "We've done well," he corrected gently. They began walking along the waterfront together, the evening air cool and soft against their faces. Around them, the laughter of families drifted through the golden light, mingling with the distant call of seagulls and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the pier. "It's strange," he said after a while. "A year ago, I wasn't sure any of this would last. I thought people would forget, that the momentum would fade once the headlines did. But they didn't," she said, "because what you built wasn't about you. It was about them, about everyone who believed in something better." He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You always knew how to make me see beyond myself." She laughed softly. "You learned how to look. That's all." They stopped near the edge of the pier, where the sunset stretched across the water in bands of gold and rose. The light shimmered on the surface like a reflection of everything they had been through: the struggle, the loss, the quiet triumphs. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty, but full of years, of forgiveness, of the kind of affection that had outgrown need and become something gentler, truer. Finally, Elliot broke the silence. "You once told me respect begins with empathy," he said quietly. "I've thought about that every day since, but I think I finally understand what you meant." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. "Tell me." He looked out over the horizon. "Respect isn't given to the powerful," he said slowly. "It's earned by the brave, by the ones who dare to see others fully." She let the words settle in the air between them. "That's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher." A gentle breeze swept through then, carrying the scent of salt and magnolia. The city's lights began to flicker on one by one, their reflections dancing on the surface of the water like small promises kept. They stood there for a long time, saying little, content just to share the same space again. The world had turned and changed, and so had they. Their love, once fierce and complicated, had softened into something timeless, a deep, enduring respect that held more grace than passion ever could. As twilight deepened, Clara looked out across the harbor and felt an unexpected peace. She realized that this moment, this calm was not the end of their story, but the beginning after the end. The place where love stopped needing to prove itself and simply chose to exist in quiet truth. Elliot turned to her then, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Clara," he said softly, "when I think about everything we've built, I realize it wasn't the houses or the projects that changed me. It was the people. It was you." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "And you showed me that even the most guarded hearts can learn to open again." They smiled at each other, no grand gesture, no lingering sadness. Just two lives that had learned how to walk beside one another without holding on too tightly. The tide rolled in, whispering against the wooden planks below. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, the sound bright and untamed, like life itself. And as the first stars appeared above the darkening sky, Clara felt a warmth settle deep within her, the kind that doesn't fade with time, because it isn't tied to endings or beginnings. It's tied to understanding, because in the end, respect, like love, was never about being admired or obeyed. It was about seeing and being seen, wholly and without judgment. And when two souls dare to see each other fully, even after the storms have passed, that's where the truest kind of peace begins. The wind shifted softly, carrying with it the promise of another day. And beneath that vast, forgiving sky, Clara and Elliot walked on side by side, their story not finished, only beautifully changed. In the end, this story isn't just about Clara and Elliot, it's about all of us. It reminds us that respect is not something we can demand, it's something we must live. True respect begins with empathy, with the willingness to listen, to understand before we judge, and to see others not for what they have, but for who they are. We live in a world that often confuses success with superiority, where voices grow louder but hearts grow quieter. Yet, as this story shows, real strength is never found in pride or wealth. It's found in humility, in the quiet courage to admit when we're wrong, to treat others with kindness even when no one is watching, and to lead not with power, but with compassion. If we want to be respected by others, we must first become the kind of people who give it freely. Because in the end, the legacy we leave behind isn't measured in achievements or titles. It's written in the hearts of those we've treated with grace. And that is the respect that never fades. Thank you so much for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness and respect still matter in our world, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that it's never too late to grow, to change, and to see others with compassion. Together, let's keep shining a little more light into the world.